Tulsi Gabbard has met the polling threshold for inclusion in the next Democratic presidential primary debate in two separate polls published in two crucial early primary states. The Boston Globe, which has the widest circulation of any newspaper in New Hampshire, published a poll earlier this month that had Tulsi at 3%. Another poll, also published earlier this month by the Post and Courier, which is the largest newspaper in South Carolina, had Tulsi at 2%. The criteria for inclusion in the upcoming debates in September and October are that a candidate must have 4 polls placing him or her at 2% or more in either state polls for the 4 early primary states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, or national polls. Tulsi currently has 2 qualifying polls. One was taken in July, sponsored by CBS in New Hampshire, and that's her first qualifying poll. The second was released just yesterday by CNN. It was a national poll that had Tulsi at 2%. But those other 2 polls that I mentioned are not deemed approved by the DNC, despite that they were sponsored by the 2 largest newspapers in 2 critical early primary states. And you have to think to yourself, why are those polls not considered approved? Again, the Boston Globe and the Post and Courier have the widest circulation of any newspaper in their respective states. They conduct polls using affiliated polling firms, whether a university or a private firm, that they use to document the state of the race in their states. But the DNC, for whatever reason, is not considering those polls to be approved. Now, what is the criteria that the DNC uses to determine whether a given poll is considered approved? Well, it's kind of inscrutable, frankly. They have put out press releases over the past couple months identifying which organizations are deemed approved sponsors. So you have CBS, CNN, Fox News, other major media organizations are considered approving sponsors for a poll for inclusion in the debates. But why the hell would the largest newspapers in 2 critical early primary states not be deemed approved? You don't have a good answer to that question. The DNC simply decreed which organizations can sponsor polls for their debate criteria. So if the DNC simply allowed those 2 polls I mentioned from New Hampshire and South Carolina to count toward a candidate's debate total for inclusion, Tulsi would be qualified, but at present, she is not. Now, I'm not alleging a concerted conspiracy here, okay? The DNC does not have it together, really, to come up with an absolutely coordinated effort to force Tulsi out of the debates, but they have instituted what you might call exclusionary criteria. And those criteria are simply arbitrary. There is no good reason why the Boston Globe and the Post and Courier should not be deemed approving sponsors of polls. But the DNC declares it to be such, and so it is. Now, it's a pretty straightforward case there for why Tulsi, if there weren't blatantly arbitrary criteria that were governing this process, ought to be in the next debate. But there are other criteria that you might also take into account. For example, she was the most Googled candidate twice in a row at each previous debate, which, at minimum, you'd think at least indicates that there is substantial interest in her campaign. If you look at social media, Tulsi tends to generate a lot of engagement, quote unquote. Look at her YouTube interviews or where she appears on various shows, and you'll see that there are almost always hundreds of thousands of views on those videos. Now, I'm not saying those criteria should be necessarily determinative or that online metrics of various kinds could not be subject to manipulation, whatever. I guess if a horde of Russian bots decided to, click refresh a billion times on a video, yeah, that could be manipulated. But that's not really what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a candidate who obviously has been able to generate noticeable enthusiasm online in particular, who is being excluded from the next debate on grounds that really are not defensible or logical. Take another example of why this process overseen by the debate, by the DNC, is fused with illogic. The DNC does allow polls conducted by YouGov to count toward the qualifying total. YouGov is a polling firm, conducts online-only polls. Reasonably reliable. But the DNC only allows YouGov polls when they're conducted in conjunction with CBS, which is an approved sponsor. YouGov also conducts polls in conjunction with The Economist. The Economist is one of the most vaunted media organizations in the world, has a considerable presence in the United States, and it, in conjunction with YouGov, conducts Democratic primary polls. Tulsi, as of today, has scored at or above the polling threshold in 6 separate YouGov Economist polls, but those polls are being excluded. Now, why? Why would a YouGov poll be acceptable when it's conducted in conjunction with CBS, but not The Economist? You tell me. The issue here is that there is arbitrariness that is operative in this entire process. There's no real reason why the DNC couldn't say, you know what, there are a variety of metrics which indicate that Tulsi has generated sufficient enthusiasm to merit inclusion in the debates, even if she doesn't meet the strict arbitrary criteria that we set out for the polling. Remember, Tulsi met the individual donor threshold, 130,000, on August 2nd. So she's already passed that threshold and is now over 160,000 donors. So that alone should tell you that there are a sizable number of people who would like to hear from her on a national stage. So the DNC could easily say, you know what, given that there are other polls that are considered reputable, that show her passing the threshold, given the online support that she clearly generates, we're going to reassess here and allow her to be in the next debate and not simply cut off the process for qualifying on August 28th, which is now the plan. So today is the 21st. She would need 2 additional polls showing her at 2% or more in the next week to officially, formally qualify. And unfortunately for her, there do not appear to be any more qualifying polls in New Hampshire coming out before the deadline. And New Hampshire happens to be her best state. In fact, there have not been any qualifying polls in New Hampshire in over a month. New Hampshire is the first primary state. New Hampshire has a large role in the process here, and yet, for reasons that are not entirely straightforward, New Hampshire is not being allocated with the ability to determine who is taking part in these debates, at least not sufficiently so. So the DNC could change course here and just say, you know what, we're going to make an adjustment and allow for her inclusion. In fact, if you look at the framework that the DNC propagated in December of 2018, they explicitly mention, this is the framework governing the debate inclusion process, they explicitly state that they reserve the right to reassess the conditions of the race on the fly, given how fluid the situation could be? Well, this would be a good time to reassess because the memories of a rigged process in 2016 are still quite fresh. Now, I'm not alleging that the process is, quote, rigged at the moment, okay? But I am alleging that arbitrary criteria are dictating how the process unfolds, which is almost just as bad. So, if only for self-interested reasons, you'd think that the DNC would want to ensure that the process was open as possible right now and didn't give the appearance of impositions that aren't well-grounded in terms of excluding or including candidates. Especially considering that Tulsi attracts an idiosyncratic kind of faction of support. A lot of leftist supporter, conservatives, libertarians, liberals. It really runs the gamut. And those are people you probably might not want to alienate this early in the process, where they feel like their favorite candidate is already being screwed on spurious grounds. Now, whether the DNC will actually do anything to rectify this is probably unlikely. And Tulsi theoretically could still qualify for the October debate, because remember, she's already got 2 qualifying polls, and those polls carry over toward her October debate total. So if she gets, say, 1 in the next week and then 1 in September, that would qualify her for the October debate, but it's silly that we're even at this point. We're still months and months away from the first voting. So why kick out somebody who obviously is generating enthusiasm and interest? Remember, she was an obscure Hawaii congresswoman who managed to now have 160,000 plus unique donors, generated a lot of positive news coverage after the second debate, especially with her exchange with Kamala Harris. And yet we're in a sort of a dearth of polling period where there haven't been that many polls that would have captured the boost she may or may not have received out of the second debate, or at least not polls that count toward the mysterious qualifying poll criteria. So the DNC might not want to get itself in a position where there's already a revolt against its decision-making process and its perception of pulling the strings in terms of how these debates are organized. So I wrote a column detailing all this for Real Clear Politics today. You might go to Real Clear Politics to see the polling averages and aggregation of various political news. The link is on the front page of the website right now, realclearpolitics.com. I'll also include it in the description box, obviously. So we'll see what happens. I will talk to you later.